In the remote village of Whispering Pines, they say if you hear a fox's laughter at the stroke of midnight, your deepest desire will come true, but always at a terrible price. Mr. Whitaker wished for youth and was found the next morning with skin smooth as a baby's, but cold in his grave, a frozen grin on his face. The struggling artist got her prestigious gallery show, but now sits before blank canvases, creativity forever drained from her mind. The desperate gambler's debts vanished overnight, but so did his ability to feel joy from any future gain or win. Mei Chen thought these were just superstitions, stories her immigrant mother clung to from the old country, until she heard that haunting, bell-like laughter echoing through her window one moonless night, and saw 9 tails disappearing into the forest shadows. Delve into the shadows where folklore and reality blur. Like and subscribe to uncover more tales of trickster spirits that dance at the edge of our world. Mei Chen had always considered herself too practical for superstitions. As the only daughter of immigrants who had settled in the small, isolated town of Whispering Pines, she grew up straddling 2 worlds, her parents' traditional beliefs and the modern skepticism she'd embraced during her years at university. Her father, Lin Chen, had been a renowned herbalist in their homeland before political upheaval forced the family to flee in the 1980s. They'd settled in Whispering Pines almost by accident. Their car had broken down on a cross-country journey, and something about the densely forested valley reminded Lin of his ancestral village. Within a year, he'd opened a small herbal medicine shop on Main Street, using knowledge passed down through 15 generations of his family. Mei had grown up among glass jars filled with roots, fungi, and dried plants whose names she learned in 2 languages. She'd absorbed her father's teachings through osmosis: how to identify ginseng by the pattern of its stem scars, how to distinguish true reishi mushroom from its less potent cousins, how to blend tea formulations for different ailments. But as she grew older, Mei had pulled away from these traditions. She'd excelled in science classes, earned a scholarship to a prestigious university on the East Coast, and built a career in digital marketing. The ancient remedies of her heritage seemed quaint compared to the evidence-based approaches she'd embraced in her education. When she received the call about her father's sudden death from a stroke, Mei had been in the middle of a strategy meeting for a pharmaceutical client. Ironically, a company whose mass-produced medications were slowly replacing traditional remedies like those her father had sold for decades. When she returned home after her father's unexpected death to help her mother run the family's herbal medicine shop, the old stories she'd dismissed as a child began to resurface. Customers would whisper about strange occurrences in the ancient forest that encircled their town like a protective embrace, or perhaps a prison. "Have you heard about Old Man Whitaker?" Mrs. Liu asked one afternoon as Mei measured out dried ginseng. "They found him this morning, grinning from ear to ear, but dead as stone." "Heart attack, probably," Mei replied, trying to ignore the chill that ran down her spine. Howard Whitaker had been a fixture in town, a cantankerous retiree who'd spent most afternoons complaining about his arthritis from his regular booth at the diner. Mrs. Liu leaned closer over the counter, her breath smelling of the chrysanthemum tea Mei's mother had prepared for her arthritic hands. "They say he was boasting in the tavern last week about hearing the midnight fox's laughter. Said he'd wished for his youth back, and look at him now, his skin smooth as a baby's, not a wrinkle to be seen, but cold in his grave." Mei's mother, who had been quietly organizing shelves nearby, interjected in Mandarin. "The Huli JNG does not give without taking. This is known." Later that evening, as they closed the shop, Mei questioned her mother about the comment. The heavy wooden sign creaked on its hinges as her mother turned the key in the ancient lock that had secured Chen family herbals since its opening day 35 years ago. "The fox spirits," her mother explained, her English giving way to Mandarin as it often did when discussing the old beliefs, "are powerful tricksters in our homeland. Here, in this forest, they have taken a different form, but their nature remains the same. They offer what your heart desires most, but the price is always more than you expect to pay." They walked home in silence through streets that grew quieter and darker with each passing year as younger residents left for opportunities in larger cities. Their family home sat at the very edge of town, the last house before the forest began, a location her father had insisted upon despite her mother's misgivings. "Mom, you can't really believe that Mr. Whitaker died because of some mystical fox," Mei said with a gentle smile as they entered the kitchen. Photographs of 3 generations of Chens watched from the walls as Mei put the kettle on for evening tea, another ritual she'd forgotten during her years away. Her mother's face remained solemn as she sat at the worn wooden table, hands folded before her. "3 days before your father passed, he told me he heard laughter in the garden at midnight. Like a fox," he said. "I thought nothing of it until after." She trailed off, her eyes distant. "What did Dad wish for?" Mei asked, humoring her mother's story despite her skepticism. She placed a steaming cup of oolong before her mother, the same blend her father had favored each evening. "For me to never be alone," her mother answered quietly. "The next day, your company extended your contract, ensuring you would return home." Mei felt a chill despite herself. Her job offer had been unexpected, almost too perfect, a remote position that allowed her to work from anywhere, including her hometown that had precisely 0 career opportunities in her field. Her boss had never before been supportive of remote work, yet suddenly had suggested it himself, citing Mei's unique value to the team. Just coincidence, she assured herself that night as she worked late in her childhood bedroom, now converted to a home office. The room faced the edge of the forest, and Mei often found her gaze drifting to the dark line of trees visible through her window. The forest had a different quality at night, the spaces between trees somehow darker than mere shadow, as if the darkness had substance and weight. The week following Mr. Whitaker's funeral brought unusual happenings to Whispering Pines. 3 more residents reported hearing strange laughter in the night. One, a struggling artist named Rebecca Walsh, suddenly received a call from a prestigious gallery in New York, offering her a solo exhibition despite her never having submitted her portfolio there. Another, Sarah Jenkins, a woman who had been trying to conceive for years and had exhausted her options for fertility treatments, announced her pregnancy. The third, Doug Peterson, a man deep in gambling debt and facing foreclosure, mysteriously received exactly the amount he owed in an envelope with no sender. Mei tracked these stories with growing unease, telling herself she was simply gathering local color for the blog she'd started to promote her mother's shop online. But part of her began to wonder if there might be something to the legends after all. The coincidences seemed too specific, the timing too convenient. Her curiosity eventually led her to the local historical society, housed in a Victorian building that had once been the town founder's home. Gloria Simmons, the elderly librarian who had been Whispering Pines' unofficial historian for nearly 50 years, greeted Mei with surprise. "A Chen, interested in local history. Your father only ever wanted to know about the forest plants for his remedies. Never cared much for our town stories." "I'm researching for the shop's blog," Mei explained. "I've heard some stories about unusual occurrences. Something about a midnight fox." Gloria's expression shifted, the polite smile replaced by something more guarded. She led Mei to a back room where archival materials were stored in climate-controlled cases. There, amid dusty archives, Mei found mentions of similar phenomena dating back to the town's establishment in 1842. "The native peoples warned the settlers not to build here," Gloria told her as Mei examined yellowed newspaper clippings. "Said this was a thin place, where the spirit world touches our own. The settlers didn't listen, of course. But they soon learned to fear the midnight laughter." The articles documented case after case through the decades. Wishes granted, followed by unexpected consequences. A barren woman blessed with triplets, only to die in childbirth. A failing farm suddenly producing record harvests, while its owner wasted away from a mysterious illness. A lost child found unharmed after wandering into the forest for 3 days, returned with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. The town nearly abandoned the settlement in 1879, Gloria explained, pointing to a faded town council record. Too many strange occurrences. But then the railroad came through, and economic interests prevailed over superstition. Mai photographed several documents with her phone, promising to return for more research. As she was leaving, Gloria called after her. If you hear it, the laughter, don't answer. Don't even acknowledge it. That's what my grandmother told me. Mai's research was interrupted by a call from her mother, frantic with worry. Mrs. Liu collapsed in the shop. They're taking her to the hospital now. At the small town clinic, barely more than an urgent care facility with limited overnight beds, Mrs. Liu lay pale against the white sheets. Her weathered face showed her 76 years, but her hands, normally gnarled by rheumatoid arthritis that had worsened over decades, lay relaxed and straight on the blanket. It was just a little wish, she whispered when Mai visited, her voice barely audible above the beeping of the heart monitor. My arthritis pains me so. I only wanted relief. Mrs. Liu, what did you do? Mai asked, remembering the old woman's keen interest in the fox stories. I went to the forest edge last night. I waited until midnight. I heard it laughing, like bells made of ice. Her eyes drifted closed. The pain is gone now, but the doctor says my heart is failing. A fair trade, perhaps, to live my last days without pain. Mai stayed until visiting hours ended, then walked home through streets emptier than usual. Even the local bar, normally lively on Friday nights, seemed subdued. As she passed, she noticed Doug Peterson inside, surrounded by drinks he'd bought for the entire establishment. Despite his apparent generosity, his face remained expressionless, eyes fixed on nothing as he mechanically raised his glass. That night, unable to sleep, Mai stood at her bedroom window, staring into the darkness of the forest. The shop ledger sat open on her desk, columns of red figures that couldn't be ignored much longer. Her mother's shop, her father's legacy, was struggling financially. They'd lost customers to chain pharmacies and online retailers. The authentic herbs her father had insisted on importing were expensive, and younger generations didn't value traditional remedies the way their parents had. Another month like the last and they might lose the shop. The herbal remedies her family had dispensed for generations would be replaced by mass-produced pharmaceuticals from the new chain store opening in the next town over. Her mother would lose not just her livelihood but her connection to the homeland she'd left behind decades ago. Just a story, Mai whispered to herself, watching her breath fog the glass. Just coincidence and suggestion and the power of belief. But at 11:55 p.m., she found herself pulling on a jacket and slipping out the back door. The night was moonless, the stars obscured by clouds. The only light came from the soft glow of windows in distant houses and the occasional sweep of headlights from the road that skirted the town's edge. The forest loomed before her, a wall of deeper darkness. Mai's phone showed 11:58 p.m. as she approached the tree line, her heart pounding. She stopped a few feet from the first trees, close enough to smell the damp earth and pine needles. The air grew noticeably colder as she stood there, and frost began to form on the grass around her feet despite it being early autumn. This is ridiculous, she told herself. You're a grown woman with a business degree standing in the cold hoping to hear a magical fox. As if in response, a sound emerged from the darkness between the trees. A soft, lilting laugh that raised the hair on Mai's arms. It wasn't quite human, higher pitched and with an edge that reminded her of wind chimes made of bones. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, impossible to pinpoint. Hello. Mai called, her voice embarrassingly small. The laughter came again, closer now. Between the trees, 2 points of light appeared, eyes reflecting the ambient light of the town behind her, too high off the ground to be any normal fox. What do you desire, Mei Chen? The voice was like rustling leaves and breaking ice, both ancient and youthful, speaking perfect Mandarin before shifting seamlessly to English. What would you trade for your heart's true wish? Mei found herself unable to back away as a figure emerged from the shadows. It had the basic shape of a fox, but stood upright on its hind legs, reaching nearly 6 feet tall. Its fur was deep red, almost black in the darkness, but seemed to shimmer with an inner light where it caught the distant glow of the town. 9 tails swayed behind it, each tipped with white as if dipped in frost. "You're not real," Mei whispered, her university education and logical mind warring with the evidence of her senses. The fox creature tilted its head, its muzzle forming what could only be described as a smile. "Am I not? Then you have nothing to fear in making a wish." It laughed again, that chilling sound that was now unmistakably coming from the being before her. Despite her fear, Mei found herself thinking of the shop, of her mother's tired eyes, of the legacy that would die if they were forced to close. Of all the knowledge her father had carried, remedies and techniques refined over centuries, that would be lost in a single generation. "I want the shop to prosper," she said before she could stop herself. "I want my mother's knowledge to be valued as it should be." A selfless wish. The fox seemed amused, its tail swaying in patterns that drew Mei's gaze and made her thoughts feel sluggish. Or is it that you fear failing where your father succeeded? Fear becoming nothing in this small town after your bright future elsewhere? Fear that in rejecting your heritage for modern ways, you've lost something essential to who you are? Mei flinched at the accuracy of the observation. The creature had articulated fears she hadn't fully acknowledged even to herself. "All wishes have a price," the fox continued. "For the prosperity you seek, I require memories. Specifically, the memories of your father teaching you the old ways, the knowledge of herbs and remedies that you've pushed aside for your modern education." "But those memories are precious to me," Mei protested. "They're all I have left of him." "Precisely." The fox's eyes gleamed. A worthy trade. The shop would flourish. Customers would come from distant cities. Your mother would see her knowledge valued again. You would have financial security and social status in this community. But you would not remember how your father's hands looked as they sorted herbs, or the sound of his voice explaining which mountains produced the finest ginseng, or the pride in his eyes when you correctly identified your first medicinal mushroom. As it spoke, images floated in the air between them, ghostly scenes from Mei's childhood. Her father kneeling beside her in his garden, teaching her how to transplant delicate seedlings. The two of them foraging in these very woods, her small hand in his larger one. Late nights in the shop when she should have been in bed, watching him prepare custom formulations for patients with difficult conditions. "Decide now," the fox said. "Midnight passes swiftly." In that moment, Mei understood the trap of the midnight fox. It offered what you wanted, but took what would hurt most to lose, a twisted mirror of desire and cost. The perfect solution that solved immediate problems while creating deeper, less visible ones. She thought of Mrs. Liu in her hospital bed, hands straight and painless for the first time in decades, but heart failing. Of Doug Peterson with his debts cleared but eyes empty of joy. Of all the stories in Gloria's archives, wishes granted that ultimately destroyed the wishers. "No," she said firmly. "No deal." The fox's expression didn't change, but something like respect flickered in its ancient eyes. "Wiser than most," it said. "But remember, Mei Chen, you sought me out. The door, once noticed, is not easily forgotten." It turned as if to disappear back into the forest, then paused. "Your father made no deal either, when I offered to ensure your return. He knew the price of interference. His death was natural, some endings cannot be bargained away." Relief and grief mingled in Mei's chest at this revelation. Then why do you do this? Why offer these terrible bargains? The fox looked back over its shoulder, its multiple tails swaying like flames. I am what I am. A tester of hearts, a mirror of desires. Some call me cruel, but I merely offer choices. Humans bring their own destruction through wanting what they cannot have. And those who made deals, Mr. Whitaker, Mrs. Liu, they chose their paths. The artist will find her gallery show cancelled when they discover she has no new works to display. Her creativity was the price of recognition. The expectant mother will bear a healthy child who will never love her. Affection was her sacrifice for fertility. The gambler is free of debt but will never feel satisfaction from gain again. His pleasure was the payment. The fox began to fade into the darkness. As for your Mrs. Liu, she knew precisely what she traded. A heart for freedom from pain. Some would call it a worthy exchange at her age. But why here? Why this town? The fox's form grew more transparent, but its eyes remained bright. This forest remembers when the world was different, when boundaries were more permeable. Such places grow rare in your modern world of concrete and steel and constant noise. I remain where I can still move between worlds. Are there others like you? There are many who offer bargains in this world, Mei Chen. I am but one among many who test the hearts of humans. Look for us in the spaces between what is and what might be. In the moment when desire overwhelms wisdom. Before Mei could respond further, the creature vanished entirely, leaving only the subtle scent of frost and wild fur. The digital clock on her phone showed 12:01 a.m. She returned home shaken but resolute, convinced she had experienced some sort of stress-induced hallucination brought on by grief, financial worry, and the power of local superstition. Yet in the morning, she found a single red-black fur on her jacket, tipped with white frost that didn't melt under her touch. The next day, she visited Mrs. Liu again. The elderly woman seemed stronger, her breathing easier though her prognosis remained poor. I met it too, Mei admitted quietly after ensuring they were alone. The fox. Mrs. Liu's eyes widened. And did you bargain? No. The price was too high. A tear slipped down the old woman's cheek. Wiser than me. Than all of us who listened to that laughter. Do you regret it? Mei asked. Mrs. Liu flexed her hands, now straight and pain-free after decades of progressive deformation. No. I lived 70 years with pain as my constant companion. To face death without it, that is worth something. But your heart was failing anyway, child. I traded pain for time. A fair bargain for an old woman. She reached out to grasp Mei's hand. But you have your whole life ahead. You were right to refuse.